Hi everyone, my name is Luke Fernandez and I'm one of this year's VIP Distinguished Speaker Series chair. Now the VIP Distinguished Speaker Series is a program brought to you by the Undergraduate Business Council of the Red McComb School for Business. Today we have Professor Robert Prentice, founding chair of the Business, Government, and Society Department at the Red McComb School of Business, interviewing Brian Gallagher, CEO and President of United Way. We will begin tonight with a Q&A between Professor Prentice and Mr. Gallagher, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A from the audience. As a reminder, today's event will end promptly at 6:30 p.m., so please refrain from leaving early. Brian Gallagher became President and Chief Executive Officer of United Way of America in 2002, and then of United Way Worldwide in 2009. In 2002, he immediately took on the challenge of leading the transformation of the organization to focus on community impact. A career veteran of the United Way system, Gallagher believes that the true measure of success for United Way and other philanthropic organizations is bottom-line results, the lives that are changed and the communities that are shaped. This represents a dynamic shift from the way United Way recognized for decades as the nation's premier fundraiser and distributor. Gallagher has raised the bar on the accountability, governance, and transparency standards adopted as a requirement of membership for all United Ways. Today, United Way has 1,800 local affiliates in 44 countries and territories, raising $5.1 billion annually, with 11 million donors and 2.5 million volunteers. Gallagher was born in Chicago and grew up in Hobart, Indiana. He received his bachelor's degree in social work from Ball State University, Muncie, Indiana, in 1981, and earned a master's degree in business administration from Emory University in Atlanta in 1992. In May 2003, Gallagher received an honorary doctorate of humanities from his alma mater, Ball State University. Please help me welcome Professor Prentice and Mr. Gallagher.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Brian, thank you so much for coming today and spending your time with us. So Luke just sort of described some of the big picture changes you've made at United Way since you took over. Can you talk a little bit about how that vision evolved and how it was implemented? Because it sounds like it was a pretty major undertaking.
Yeah, it was, I guess, a group of us before I became the CEO of United Way of America in the late 90s started seeing that the issues that we were working on in communities all across America weren't getting better. Public education seemed to be getting worse. The income gap was growing even though macroeconomic growth was there. Fewer people had access to health care, and yet we were raising more money and talking about how successful we were as an institution. And it just seemed to me that, again, a group of us started to realize that the U.S. was changing so quickly economically and socially that we were going to have to shift to stay with it. That clearly we had globalized as an economy, technology was changing everything, and we were the ultimate middleman in a transaction business. People were giving us money and then we were giving it to other nonprofit agencies. So our market changed on us. We, as early as the 1990s, we were adding 35,000 new nonprofits every year in the U.S. on a net basis. But the human condition wasn't getting better. So all we did, we're 125 years old, and we went back and we said, you know, the economic and social shift that we're experiencing now in the U.S. is as dramatic as the Industrial Revolution. And all we did was we went back 100 years and said, what were we doing 100 years ago? And it wasn't counting how much money we raised. It was trying to get different interests together in communities to identify the issues that they had in common, even if they weren't from the same sector. So business leaders and organized labor, government leaders, nonprofit, religious leaders, neighborhood leaders, and just went back to saying, let's figure out what are the biggest issues the country's facing. Let's see if we can get people to agree on how to get after it. And then let's try to not just raise money, but get people to volunteer for it, mobilize people to make a change. We had to do it. Pragmatically, the market shifted on us, and we couldn't take up as much space as we were taking and watch some of the human issues, quite honestly, not improve and feel good about it.
Can you give me some examples of how that manifested itself on the ground, the new approach?
Yeah. So if you want to get it, get real about it, when we defined ourselves as a fundraising organization, we would raise money, and for a finite group of nonprofit agencies. So Boy Scouting, Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCAs, organizations that lots of people knew. And we would raise a lot of money and fundamentally give the same nonprofit organizations about the same amount of money every year. And if you're serious about what I just described in terms of a shift, you don't do that. You say, all right, if we're instead going to try to cut the high school dropout rate in half in the United States over the next 10 years, who are the partners that are best prepared to help us do that? And you start shifting your resources. And some of the agencies you're funding are still there and doing great work, but some aren't. And if you try to take money away from an organization that you've been giving money to for the last 30 or 40 years, that dog bites. And so you have to be very strategic about setting outcomes and goals at a community level, not an institution level. You need new competencies and skills in your volunteers and your staff. You need new metrics of success. How do you know that you're actually not just running a good funding a good after-school program, but you're actually making systemic change at a school district level? You had to go through all those kind of shifts, and we still are going through those kind of shifts.
I realize you're going through those kinds of shifts in a very difficult economy. What are your metrics telling you about your levels of success?
We actually, we've been growing every year throughout the last decade. When we hit 08 and 09, all charitable giving in the U.S. dropped. We dropped less than overall charitable giving in the U.S. And charitable giving in the U.S. is precisely tied to income, precisely tied to GDP growth. So if GDP declines, charitable giving declines. And one of the things that we made sure that we did was we're more laser beam focused on human need than we've ever been. And so we made sure that our corporate donors, our foundation donors, our individual donors knew as local United Ways what we were doing to respond to people who are now in housing crisis and food crisis, and people responded to it. And now the last year giving is up. We grew 8.5% outside the U.S., 3.5% overall. People are investing more and more in issues that they care about, not just passing their money through their United Way to their favorite agencies. So the trust numbers are up year over year. So, if you look at it, same with a corporation. People will buy a company's product if they believe that company, equal another competitor, are more socially responsible, care about an issue that I care about, and as we got more issue focused and more outcome focused, all the metrics that you want to see financially have improved for us.
In terms of issues, do you pick nationwide issues or community by community?
We do both. We are probably best described as a nonprofit franchise. We're an individual consumer-based nonprofit brand. That's what we are. 11 million consumers who make an incredibly elastic decision about whether to give their money to you or not. We're 1,800 local United Ways. Each one is an independent nonprofit organization. We at United Way Worldwide own the name United Way and the brand mark United Way, and we set the governance rules, the financial management, membership requirements. But in every one of those communities decide what are the issues they should focus on, and more importantly, how should they focus on it. Having said that, for the first time in almost my 30 years in United Way, we've set national goals in the United States. And so we've got fundamental agreement across the 1,200 United Ways in the U.S. around high school graduation, around trying to close the income gap and trying to create greater access to health care, and focused on youth health. And so we set these macro national goals, but then importantly, each local United Way decides how to get after it and who should be at the table and how they should spend money, because public policy in Texas is different than public policy in California. And New York City is not Miami. And so you make sure that each one of those unique sets of history, culture, politics, economies go after high school graduation, for instance, in the way that makes sense for them.
I have to tell you, before we had our little conversation, before we came down here, I hadn't thought a lot about the United Way internationally. Would you share with the audience a little bit about what you told me about your goals in China?
Yeah, so we have, as you heard, we have United Ways in over 40 countries around the world, and we, United Way International was an arm of United Way of America as early as 1974. And we spun that out in 1992. When I came into the U.S. job in '02, we had a lot of work to get done in the U.S. in terms of just getting our own operation in order. But it was clear to me that if the U.S. was going to be successful in United Way, we were going to have to be part of a worldwide network. So we put the two organizations back together again in May of 2009, and we've been about going to every one of those countries and putting in place rigorous agreements on governance, transparency, financial management. And what's happening in China, I was there Tuesday in Beijing to sign a partnership agreement with the China Charity Federation. The China Charity Federation is the biggest nonprofit in China. It's also what's referred to as a gango, which is a government-supported nonprofit. So if you go and meet the local head of the China Charity Federation in Dalian, that person's kind of a cross between the mayor and the United Way executive. And so this agreement requires China Charity Federation to follow our governance standards, our financial management standards, our membership requirements, and so it goes way beyond the requirement of the Chinese government. It gives us access to the Chinese market, and it gives China Charity Federation access to our corporate relationships, our knowledge, and what's going on in China in the NGO world is the government is gradually liberalizing civil society the same way that they liberalize the economy. And they're doing it in a hypersensitive environment around voluntary association. So we consult with the government on tax law and how you do that in a way that, quite honestly, the Chinese government wants a harmonious society, and we're trying to convince them that you loosen this up the right way, you can keep a stable society and still have greater civic involvement in terms of everyday life.
What sorts of goals do you have there comparable to increasing the high school graduation rate of the United States? What's at the top of your list over there?
Well, it's what's different about if you look at North America and Europe, you're trying to hold on to the middle class. In this economic shift. In India, China, Brazil, developing countries around the world, you're trying to build the middle class. And so you set goals around kids in school, support around young people in school, financial support that, in a lot of cases, families don't have pensions and don't have safety net, and the government's starting to put that in place. So where we would, in the U.S., focus on high school graduation, this focuses on making sure that kids in rural communities are in school, that they've got the support that might not be there in a government safety net. And importantly, it's the volunteer leaders in those communities that decide exactly how to do it.
You've sort of touched on this already, but what are some of your major reservations or, I guess, worries about this expansion in China?
Well, it's not just China. And by the way, I've looked at the CEOs that have been in this chair, and we work with all of them, quite honestly. I'm nervous about the same thing they're nervous about, which is there's stuff going on in your organization, good and bad, that you don't know about. And you have to put in place the kind of mechanisms and culture that tries to prevent anything that would hurt your reputation, that would hurt communities. And again, I don't have that concern as much in the U.S., but I had it when I started this job 10 years ago.
Do you think that the challenge for you to protect your brand is even greater than the challenge for major for-profit corporations, the Toyotas, et cetera? They can have a little scandal and their sales drop precipitously. I assume that's an even bigger problem for you.
Well, here's the thing that's different about reputation is reputation, and trust is trust. I made the point earlier that, United Way or any charitable organization, by and large, when you invest in United Way, you don't get anything for it, except feeling good about yourself and self-actualizing as a human being, but you don't get a car, you don't get a pair of shoes, and so you don't have product. And so that's what makes charitable giving so elastic. You still need a pair of shoes. You might switch one company to another, but there are people that if you damage your reputation, it just stops. People just stop. And so that's what's different. What's the same is you've got to create value, and you have to create a trusting relationship with your consumers. And if you do that, then all the metrics that a Toyota or a United Way wanting to see go north, go north. The last thing I would say on that is that our world is, anyone who's in the business school here has learned about, rational capital markets and true return on investment. Giving to nonprofit organizations is not a rational capital market. I watch money chase really bad ideas all the time. And I watch really good ideas not attract nearly the capital that it should if there was this really transparent return. And so there are similarities and there are differences, but reputation is reputation.
Let me shift gears and ask, did you consciously choose a career in the nonprofit field, or did you just sort of fall into it?
A little bit of both. I guess technically I fell into it, but it's like a lot of things that you do in life. You don't know why you pursue it until you're a little older and you can reflect back on it and so forth. But I grew up the product of systems. So my dad immigrated here from Ireland, my mom from Scotland. Neither had a high school degree. He was a pretty angry guy, created a pretty difficult home environment. So we were, most times we had the money we needed. We always didn't have it. So we lived on public assistance and food stamps, and so that system was there. There was violence in the house, there was counseling services from nonprofits and so forth. And you don't think about that as a kid. You just kind of do what you do. And but I was the fourth of six, and my two older brothers and sisters didn't go to college. I was hanging out with a family that clearly their kids were going to go to college, so I did college visits with them and so forth. And I say all that to say, when I decided to go to Ball State, it had to be in-state in terms of being able to afford it. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but clearly the way I grew up affected me. And why were there people helping my mom and helping my brothers and sisters, and why was that stuff there? And so I started as a history major, and then I decided that when I found out about social work, I shifted to social work. And as I said to a group earlier, my dad was not happy about that decision. But I did it, and I realized that I couldn't do direct service. And so, so I did kind of fall into it, but then I started thinking about it. And my life experience kind of pushed me in that direction. And I realized I can't do direct service. I just don't, you have to be cut out to do home visits and so forth. But I love the business side of it and the community organizing side of it. So I started taking business classes, and that's why I pursued the MBA later on. So it was both unconscious and conscious, but it took a bit of reflection, both in school and then once I got out of school, to realize that I was choosing this profession, but I didn't know I was choosing it at the time, and I didn't know why I was choosing it.
When I heard you talk about all the employees and all the branches and all the offices overseas and all the strategic planning and all the controls, it sounded to me like you face pretty much all the challenges that a CEO of a major for-profit corporation would face. Would that generally be accurate?
It is accurate. What's interesting is that if you look at a corporation, you really can't compare and contrast a major corporation and a major nonprofit just as those two entities. You have to say, what kind of corporation is it, and what kind of nonprofit is it? And so I would, retail companies resonate with me, because you've got all these retail outlets, you've got some level of standardization, but you don't have everything you want. And so there are some corporations that are pretty decentralized, and we're pretty decentralized. There are some nonprofits that are very centralized and some corporations that are very centralized. So it's really comparing and contrasting kind of what is the business model that is most effective for your organization, corporate or not. And the thing that's great about our model is we've got 1,800 local United Ways, and we have a set of standards in terms of how you operate and so forth. And now we have agreement on education, income, and health issues. But how you do it is up to communities. And so we've got 1,800 social innovation labs. And so any corporation would kill for that, to be able to look into a market, and they have complete freedom at the strategy level to decide how to go after a business objective, and then we watch it all, and when something starts to work, we codify it, and we spread it, and we scale it. And so, you know, the best corporations in the world, you know, are looking for that. Tata in you know, the Indian conglomerate, I was on a panel with a senior person from Asia recently, and he talks about exactly how that's how they do their innovation. You know, they push that freedom down into units, and then they codify what comes out of that, and then they scale it by spreading it across the operation.
Well, I see a lot of similarities in terms of the challenges. Are there special rewards running a nonprofit? The life of a nonprofit entrepreneur?
Sure. I mean, it's you know, I'm purpose driven. You know, I do what I do because, and I've been doing it my whole life, right out of college, and stayed with it because that's what I want to do. I want to be a part of changing people's lives, and I want to do it at scale. And you know, I love people who do it every single day at an individual level, but I want to do it at scale. And one of the things that I really believe, and what's rewarding for me now, especially with the worldwide work, is that if we really are a global community, which obviously I believe we are, then just like any really strong community, you can't leave the relationship management just to business and just to government. You have to have civil society in that discussion. And you need organizations like ours and others to be at Davos and to talk about the future of communities and country and world, because when we do our job right, we're speaking for individuals, we're speaking for citizens, and that's important. And I think that civil society organizations need to get much more intentional and aggressive the right way in being part of the social contract discussion in cities, in country, in the world. And to me, there's no better job in the world to do that.
So I'm guessing I know the answer to this question, but increasingly I have my students show an interest in nonprofit work, in adding to the community, et cetera. What, would you recommend that as a career path? Would you recommend they start with that right away, do something else first?
You know, here's two thoughts, I guess. First, this generation blends it all. You know, this idea that, you know, I could think that I'm going to get my social work degree, then I'm going to get my MBA, is that this generation sees it all blending together. That, you know, social entrepreneurship, businesses that actually create common good and community value, which I think is incredibly exciting. So what I would say is, if what you want to do is you know, change the human condition in whatever scale, choose your vehicle. It can be a business, it can be government, it can be a nonprofit. You know, I know Jeff Immelt at GE pretty well, and Jeff got creamed for coming in with his eco-imagination idea because it wasn't returning right away. It's $18.5 billion in revenue a year now, and he absolutely believes that he can drive that business by doing good. So I would say decide what it is that kind of floats your boat, and then what is it that is the vehicle that you think is right for you. I will say this, that work with a lot of social workers, and I work with a lot of business leaders, and all the social workers I know need some business training, and most of the business leaders I know need some social work training. So find the balance in terms of being able to do each and choose the path that feels right to you.
Obviously, a lot of major for-profit corporations are getting heavily involved in corporate social responsibility types of actions. Many of them have their own causes. Do you believe that's a responsibility that they have?
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting, and I've spent a lot of time in those kind of conversations now, and I hate that I can go back this many years, but I'm going to do it just to make the point that when I started in the early 80s, if I'm working with business leaders who say are in their 40s, then they were running their businesses in the 50s and 60s and some earlier, and no one had ever heard the term corporate social responsibility. The best leaders were already practicing it. That they understood that if they're going to optimize their marketplaces and their workforces, they were going to have to focus on the environment in which those individuals lived. And that you wouldn't get a short-term payoff on it, but you'd get a long-term payoff on it. I was with again in this panel in Dalian last week, there was a Chinese business leader who used a metaphor that I'll never forget. He said, the fish needs the water and the water needs the fish. That it has to work together. And so all I would say is that I believe business writ large in the US through most of the 80s and into the 90s lost their way on their community responsibility. Not everybody, but generally. They put it into marketing budgets, they put it into brand positioning, and they forgot that it was really about building a sustainable marketplace and workforce. And CSR became the discipline that started putting that thought leadership back together again. So the short answer to a long way of saying is, yeah, I think business has a responsibility beyond profitability. And in fact, it's in its interest to, if it wants healthy marketplace, wants qualified workforce, to care about the water and not just the fish in it.
You mentioned Jeff Immelt and GE. Any other leaders or corporations that you particularly admire along those lines?
You know, UPS is a great organization. Some of the companies coming from the emerging markets, the Tata Group I mentioned, you know, this family-owned conglomerate in India is an incredible group. Very different, but starting to trying to figure this out are a couple of the Korean companies, Samsung, LG, that are very focused on now. I think they again got caught up in kind of the marketing spin of CSR a decade ago. I think they're now starting to do the right kind of work. You know, Samsung made a $1 million gift to the local United Way here in Austin. They get the fact that, you know, they're going to be in a marketplace. They got to invest back in community. So there's mid-sized and smaller companies as well.
I'm down to my last question to you, and one thing that we like to ask in these settings is, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
I was running the United Way in Columbus, Ohio. We were making this shift, trying to convince business leaders and nonprofits that we should focus on big issues instead of just raising money and funding programs. And there was a guy running a firm called Battelle Memorial, which is a huge research and development outsource shop. It for instance, patented photocopy. And a brilliant business leader, and I was visiting with him and talking about what we were going to do, and he says, oh, so you're going to work on education. And you know, everybody had broken their pick on education. What he said was, if you're going to do it, set the bar so high that it forces everybody, most especially you, to change how you do your work. Because if you don't, and try to create that level of change, somebody or some things will go outside the process and come back and kill it or kill you. So set the bar high, force change, and see who rises to the job. And he was right, and it's always right. If you negotiate strategy to the least common denominator, then you're gonna negotiate it down again, and it wasn't worth the exercise.
Great. Well, thanks very much for chatting with me. It's now time to chat with the audience. And so those of you in the audience who have questions, come on up to the microphones and please fire away, and please don't be shy.
Hi, my name is Eva Golnick, and thank you for coming today. I was wondering, sorry, I need to lower it. I was wondering if you could talk about how you choose which, I mean, I know you talked about what kind of targets and what kind of programs you like to choose, but what about who you choose to kind of partner with or to work with, and what kind of problems you encounter when you do have to choose, whether it be political affiliations or religious affiliations, and kind of talk about those things.
Yeah, no, I get the question. It's essentially, if I understand the question, how do we select our partners as well as who we invest in? Mm-hmm. And it's, first of all, we're non-political. We're incredibly engaged in public policy, but we are nonpartisan. Had great relationships with the Bush White House, have great relationships with the Obama White House. That would be true in state capitals as well. And you choose your partners on who can be relatively more effective than the next person. So that point about setting the bar high. So if you say we want to reduce by half the number of young people dropping out of high school in the next 8 years, that means you have to graduate an additional 600,000 kids by that last year. Once you set that standard, you say, who can help us do that? And you start getting pretty clear pretty fast. And so it's who's most effective, who's competent, who can measure results, who has capacity, who's willing to measure their work and not. And you run into tons of politics and tons of inertia. And the thing that I've learned is that if you can put to detractors, here's the track record, here's how somebody produced, how somebody didn't produce, it doesn't always win the day politically, but it helps.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Ed Zhang. I'm just going back to what you mentioned about the CCF. You said they were a government-sponsored organization. So my question is, how do you maintain the balance between ensuring that your regulations are followed and not coming into conflict with the Chinese government?
Very carefully. Very carefully. The contract that we signed with the China Charity Federation is unique to any one we signed in the world, because it is aligned with government so closely. But our calculation was that, you know, there are independent nonprofits in China. The China Youth Foundation is completely independent. Our calculation was that civil society is going to open up the same way that the economy did, and that you're going to have to be able to work with government. And so we negotiate with minister-level leaders in China at the same time that we're negotiating with the China Charity Federation at Beijing level, but also Shanghai, Dalian, Tianjin, and so forth. So we're negotiating at all levels, and it took us 3 years to agree on what they could agree to, in other words. And by the time you're in Beijing, as you probably know, and you're signing this, they have permission from government to sign it. And so we had negotiated what they could agree to and what they couldn't agree to. And it was pretty tense at times over that 3 years, but that's the way you have to work in China. And now the key will be, how do we keep our working relationship? And how do we make sure that the reporting that they're supposed to do with us, they actually do with us? And I think that will be driven by value exchange. If they see real value, one of the things they want is they want access to the global 500 companies that we have relationships with. And if we introduce those and that goes well, and they hold up their end of the bargain on accountability and transparency, and government sees that it isn't causing instability, then you get to keep going. So it's something you manage month to month, year to year.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Sunny Das. And regarding the 10-year initiative that you had started in 2008, I was just wondering what the status of it was in terms of progression towards the goals of that program.
Yep. So we set, what he's referencing to is we set in 2008 national goals in the U.S. around education, financial stability, and health. We're making significant progress. I would say the progress is at city level. So you look at Dallas and you look at Los Angeles and you look at New York and you can see real progress against some of those issues. There's some significant progress on the number of high schools in the U.S. that are producing most of the high school dropout rate, or most of the high school dropouts. 3 years ago, there were 21 high schools in the U.S., 13% of the high schools that were producing 53% of the high school dropouts. Today, there's 1,700. So there's progress there at a macro level nationally. But I would say that one of the things that's making me nervous is that we're not scaling fast enough, that we're going to have to find the accelerant, that it could be media, it could be national partnerships. If we try to do this city by city by city, I'm afraid we're not going to make the goals in the 10-year frame. So the good news is we've got a good base and people making progress. We're right now, honestly, in a discussion around how do you accelerate the scale faster. So the progress is good, but we're going to have to adjust the strategy again if we're going to meet all those targets in 18.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hi, Mr. Gallagher. You talked about setting the bar high to force change. In your time at United Way, what is the biggest, most innovative change you've seen, and how has it been applied to the larger United Way setting?
Well, I guess it would be two things. Creating a worldwide organization was a big deal, and not easy. Before we put the worldwide organization together, the only United Ways that had any voting rights in the world were U.S. United Ways. And so what we asked local United Ways in the U.S. to formally vote on was to give up some of their power to United Ways outside the U.S. That was a big deal. And we argued it that it would be in their best interest. And we don't vote on a lot of things. And when we vote on things, we're like a corporation in this instance. We'd like to know the outcome of the vote before we call it. We didn't know the outcome of that vote, and it was a 60-40 vote. We got the merger done. So that's one. The other big innovation that we've seen over the last number of years is, so we're talking about the way we've lived is that you fund great programs and great agencies, and now we want to make community change. You can't have, increase the number of great programs by 10% and change education in Texas. You actually have to do things differently. One of the things we've learned that if you think of when any big social changes happened, civil rights, apartheid, smoking in public places, drunk driving, girls in sports, it was people who mobilized. And what we've realized is we got to get people back involved in trying to create social change. That's a big change for us, and we've got United Ways now all over the world trying to get people engaged. Starting United Ways on college campuses, using social media, creating young leaders society. We have 55,000 women leaders now who are organized and mobilizing. What we realize is we got to give up some control if we're going to create real change, and that's for us. That's a big innovation, and I would say it's what's certainly needed in the U.S. We got to get people back involved in creating social change because the narrative in this country is too polarized and too dominated by political leaders.
Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to ask about how you communicated your change in approach through your branding.
Through branding.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a great question. I'd been in United Way for 20 years before I came into the United Way of America job, and what I realized, within the first year, that my number one job was brand stewardship, that I just hadn't really thought about it. And so there was a consultant who was working with us at the time who was unbelievable on brand. And I convinced her to join our team. She's, in my view, the best brand leader in the nonprofit sector. And what she taught me about brand and McCann World Group and Future Brand and so forth is that brand is an experience. Is that brand's not a logo. Brand is an experience. And if our experience that people had with us was all about money, and give us more money, then that's going to be your brand. What we've learned is that as we've become more involved in issues that people care about, and if you help people get involved in it, that starts to define your brand. So we created this brand campaign called Live United. And Live United is an invitation for people to get involved in their communities. It's the second time in my career, in 29 years, that our brand campaign matched our strategy. 2 times. Because we said we wanted to get people involved in communities, we want to get focused on issues. Live United's the invitation to do it. It became a top 5 ad council campaign in the first year. So brand was about, let's get back to relationships with individuals. Let's give them avenues to get involved in their communities. And what's interesting about the brand metrics is that when people know that you're working on issues that they care about, better yet, when you ask them to get involved in it, tell them what happened, your brand and your trust numbers go up. So we're incredibly focused on it, but not from a marketing perspective, from an experience perspective.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. A lot of nonprofits have a problem working abroad because a lot of the times the governments are the issue and why people don't have certain social rights. So how does United Way decide whether or not it's worth working with a government that might not have the best of intentions just to help the people?
It's another great question. We are not an international relief organization first. And I think that's important in terms of contextually how I answer this question. In fact, I would say that we need international relief, and it's mostly international relief organizations that will butt heads with certain governments and so forth. But we are, my view, we have to start building nonprofit and civil society infrastructure that is homegrown in communities and in country. And that's the best way, I think, to deal with government. So, relatively speaking, in Africa, Ghana would be an easy one. But Ghana, for instance, has all the resources, human and otherwise, physical, that it ever needs to sustain themselves as a country. They don't need, over the long haul, more and more international aid. What they need is organizations working with government to build civil society infrastructure run by Ghanaians. And they then will create the relationship with government. That's not to say when you've got corrupt government or even abusive government, you do need civil society organizations and NGOs that will call that out. But in our context, we look for places where we think we can build an infrastructure, even if it is, we for instance have a United Way in Venezuela, and still have a United Way in Venezuela. And you do it because the local leaders say we think we can still make a difference. We still think we can deal with this government. It's not ideal. When I tell you, we have a local United Way in Moscow, and I'm within almost no time of pulling our license out of there. I find Russia more difficult to deal with than sub-Saharan African countries. So the point is, our local leaders have to say to us, we don't think we can do this anymore. Or we have to think it gets so bad that we're going to just say we're going to pull out.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Mr. Gallagher. As a computer science major, I'm kind of curious to know how technology has changed the role, of charitable organizations, and where you really see the role of technology going in the world of charities.
Technology and charities, kind of goes without saying, but access. Access to information, access to each other. I think what it's already starting to do, but what I would say the biggest change that technology is going to bring to our world is this idea of crowdsourcing in terms of social innovation. So how do you name any social issue, any community, anywhere in the world, the easier we make it for people to try to solve that problem together and not having to come through a government or an institution, but we ought to facilitate it. That's, I think, going to be the biggest innovation. The other stuff is easy to see. Giving is going to happen on handheld devices. It already is. Right now, the difference is that most giving that's done through technology and handheld devices is spontaneous. It's not, so an earthquake happens and you give $10 and so forth. I think what's going to change is going to be the interaction, the problem solving, the strategy development, and then the giving is going to follow that. And it's going to allow a lot, many, many more people into social solution sessions. And we're working hard to get ahead of that, working with technology companies to help us figure out how do you do what Starbucks does. Starbucks uses their technology to send emails to their customers to say, when Howard Schultz came back as CEO, he sent an email to and a text to all the data they had, and he said, I'm back as CEO. If you were me, what one thing would you do? And he got thousands and thousands of responses, and they implemented them. You know that green stick that you put in your Starbucks cup that covers the hole so you don't spill it? That came through a crowdsourcing suggestion directly to the CEO of Starbucks. That's what technology is going to do for social issue solutions, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Aside from some of the things you've already mentioned, what have you discovered are some of the major pros and cons of running a nonprofit organization as opposed to a for-profit?
Well, I've never run a for-profit. We do have a for-profit subsidiary, which people don't realize nonprofits can actually have for-profit subsidiaries, but we can. But I have worked with a lot of business leaders, and the pros and cons is that large nonprofits, as big as we are, we're under-resourced compared to big corporations. Big corporation can raise capital to create additional value. All of the capital that we raise has to, kind of come through goodwill and so forth. So that's a big difference. Even though I talked about centralized and decentralized, if you're running a big nonprofit, the way that you lead is not management and control. It's through influence, it's through strategy, it's through vision, and for-profit leaders have more control over their day-to-day operation, if you will. Having said that, I think if you can run not just a big nonprofit as big as this one, but a complex, larger nonprofit, the leadership skills that you develop, I would put up against any corporate set of leadership skills, having worked with a lot of corporate leaders, because you're under-resourced, you don't have command and control, you're still held to value creation standards and metrics, financial metrics, complete transparency, and if you can succeed in that environment, you could go, I've talked to a lot of folks that have done both, gone for-profit to nonprofit and vice versa. It's the for-profit folks that struggle the most in our world, because there's no straight line between 2 points in our world.
I'm sorry, I forgot to mention I actually have 2 questions. The second one is less serious, but this is my first semester at UT, and Ball State was actually one of the other schools I was thinking about because they have a really good entrepreneurship program. I was just wondering what your favorite thing about Ball State was.
What was the program that they had that you thought was good?
Entrepreneurship.
Oh, the entrepreneurship program. Yeah, it is. Let me just tell you this. I'm on the foundation board at Ball State now, which, again, if they would have checked my record, they never would have invited me back. I love Ball State. It was life-changing for me. You're better in Austin than Muncie. Let me just say that. Muncie's tough.
Hi, Mr. Gallagher. Would you speak about your first job and what kind of lessons you learned from that job that you've been able to bring forward as your role as CEO of United Way?
Yeah, it's probably like a lot of you. As I think about jobs, I think about all my jobs. So as stupid as this sounds, and we don't have these anymore, but I was a paper boy. And that was a tough job. It was especially if you're in Chicago. It's Sunday morning. You've got what the Sunday paper's like. It's snowing, it's 0, and you got to get up at 5:30 and go deliver those damn papers. And you're 13. And so then dishwasher, then restaurant, and so just kind of worked through high school. The first job that really affected me, was working construction during summer when I was going to college to pay my way through college. And working at Standard Oil and U.S. Steel and putting in sewer pipes and so forth, and how tough that job was, how tough they were, and working with guys who are going to be doing that their whole lives. And I thought, wow, that's, you know, this is why you're going to school, this is why, you know, because what they're doing is fantastic, I don't want to do it. So when I got into my first job, moved from Chicago to Winston-Salem, by that time I think I had a work ethic that had been framed by where I grew up and the jobs I'd had. And so hours didn't bother me. I was doing second and third shift meetings in our fundraising campaign, and then getting up the next morning and going to work, and then resting on the weekends is the way I looked at it. So I was shaped by, you know, you learn from people in your jobs, not just your bosses. And so just keeping my eyes open for my peers that I really respected how they did their work. And it was always people who were, again, purpose-driven and did the right thing. You know, no one's asked it, but one of the things that these jobs taught me is the kind of people I want to be around. And as you get more responsibility in your career, you get to influence that. And so what I've realized is that for-profit, nonprofit, government, I want to be around people who are purpose-driven, who want to do something, who want to change the world, who are results-oriented, you know, want a tangible result, who are collaborative, work well with other people, and who are kind. That's who I want to be around. Because if you have the first three, you know, you're purpose-driven, you're results-oriented, you're collaborative, but you're a jerk, then that affects the culture of your organization. And my jobs all along the way taught me, and it took me a while to figure that out, but working with all the people who had different parts of those characteristics made me realize that's who I want to be, that's who I want to surround myself with.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Mr. Gallagher. My name is Spencer Davis. First of all, thank you again for coming to speak to us today. Can you discuss your partnership with the NFL and how it's affected the nation?
Yep. And since no one would get it, I'm not going to do the Spencer Davis crack that people have given you so many times probably in your life. The NFL, it's an interesting relationship because in 1970, there was no United Way. And for any of you who are football fans, there was no NFL. There essentially were these two competing leagues, and there were two leaders. Pete Rozelle was the commissioner going to become the commissioner of the National Football League, and a guy named Bill Aramone, who did some major damage to United Way later in his career, was the CEO in this job at the time, and they were both thinking about building brands. And they had this conversation. Rozelle was going to the networks to negotiate these television contracts, which have become so big, and even big in college sports, that you might even leave one conference for another. And so he was negotiating this deal, and he said to the network, if you sign this deal, I'll take $40 million of that airtime and give it to this nonprofit. And so that's when you started seeing these NFL commercials, players talking about United Way, and it was about building awareness of the two brands. And it worked beautifully. I mean, it exploded. And so it was we've had this relationship for 37 years. And so the United Way NFL partnership has brand equity on its own. Where their brand is strong, we're weak. Where we're strong, they're weak. What's happened now it's now ebbed and flowed. For any of you watching football games, you don't see a lot of these ads for two reasons. The NFL is now taking that time that Rozelle negotiated and giving it back to itself. So the NFL apparel stuff, the Play 60 stuff, that NFL-centric stuff, that's our time. They took it back. But on the other hand, they're wanting to get, where we can help them are with women potential fans and minorities. And so they're doing the spots off game, trying to attract those, and where we're exploding with the NFL is in social media. And the Live United campaign is a complete intersection with their youth fitness. And so what's happened, the NFL is a cartel, a legal cartel. And And, well, it is. And so less is happening at the league office. More is happening from the teams. So Jerry Jones in Dallas is trying to decide, you know, what he wants, and the league can't tell him what to do and so forth. So what's happening is we're doing more and more deals with players and with teams, and we're selling up through social media and through local market. There's a player in Philadelphia, Nnamdi Asamoah, and he's our spokesperson. And Nnamdi is big into education, and he with us created this college access program that we're recruiting 1 million additional volunteers for education. Nnamdi's agreed to recruit a player from every team that the NFL take 100,000 of them. Well, now the league is paying attention to Nnamdi, so it's kind of flipped around. Complicated answer to say it's a complicated relationship that I think is now going to kind of live in the new world.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, Mr. Gallagher. My name is Alex Flores. I had a bit of a more personal question to ask you. Who was your mentor?
I had a few. You know, there was, again, when you grew up in the house that I grew up in, you were out of the house as much as you could be out of the house. And so when you're that age, you can end up in a good spot or you can end up in a bad spot. I happened to end up in a friend's house whose dad was like, for any of you who played sports, you know how this dad and now moms, like they seem to coach everything? And he's the soccer coach. He doesn't know a thing about soccer. He's the baseball coach. And he just took an interest in me. And he started coaching me and drafting me on his team. And I started hanging out at his house. And he just became my father. And so growing up, he taught me how to be a man. And then I fell into this other family that another friend's mom took a real interest in me, and they were the ones that I went on college visits with and so forth, and I went to college because of her. And then in my first job, there was my direct boss in Winston-Salem, was somebody I respected, and he spent time with me, and there was never any of this formal, will you be my mentor stuff. It just happened. And then the last one I'll tell you about is, and because it's a concept that I think really makes sense. I was in Rhode Island, and I developed this aptitude for raising money and marketing, even though I was a social worker and I wanted to change the world. And there was this guy running the United Way in Atlanta who I'd met, and he was like this rock star in United Way. And he asked me to come to Atlanta, and I said, you know, I don't want to run any more campaigns. I was working on my MBA, and I said, only if you give me assignments working in community. That's what I want to do. And we went back and forth on this conversation, and he said, why don't we enter into a social contract? I said, what's a social contract? He said, help put our campaign back together again and get it growing, which I was pretty confident I could do. And once I feel confident that's going to happen, I'll start giving you all these other assignments. Working in community, working on the governance side. And we didn't sign anything. We didn't sign anything. And I said, okay. And I went down and I did it and he did it. And he, to this day, is one of my best friends. He's retired now, but he was willing to enter into a social contract with me. That I know what you want, I'll give you what you want, but I need for you to do this. And if he wouldn't have done it, then he wouldn't have been a mentor. But it was informal. There was no signing of papers. And he still is today. He's still a person I call when I'm not sure what to do on something. And it's so they're personal and they're professional.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
One last question.
I hope it's a good one. I have a question, well, obviously. I was wondering if your efforts to improve education here in the United States, as well as efforts of organizations here in the U.S., what do you think will happen if the education system doesn't improve?
Here in the U.S.?
Yes.
If education in America doesn't dramatically improve in the next 10 years, let me say it for effect first, and then I'll come back. We're dead. One of the things that I say in speeches all around the country that resonates most with people, and I have this question myself, is I think more and more people are wondering, have we peaked as a country? Have we peaked? And most civilizations, most societies, once they peak, go in one direction. And I think the most significant determinant for that is education, public education. You can't have 1 out of every 4 young incoming high school freshmen not graduate in the US and expect to be competitive in the world economy. It's not going to happen. The income gap is the widest it's been since the 1920s. You're not going to have social stability in the country. You know, London, everybody talks about the Arab Spring, and that's real. What about London? What about LA? What about New York? You can't have that kind of gap, opportunity gap, and education's the way you close that opportunity gap. We have got to get this figured out. If we don't, then we're not competitive. I think at some point we risk our social stability. We decline as a country. The statistics are amazing. 1 out of every 4 young people in the U.S., 17 years old or younger, is Hispanic. The high school graduation rate for Hispanics in the U.S. is 53%. I mean, it's not sustainable. So it has to become the country's biggest issue. And that's why I say, you know, there are great political leaders at all levels, but our political leaders right now are not up to the game. And the only way they get up to the game is when enough individuals get organized to say, we need a different result. And I think, obviously, we've got to deal with the debt issue in states and the country, and that's real, and that'll have to happen. But education has to be at the same level, because if it's not, we're just not going to be the same nation that we've been for over 200 years.
Thank you very much, Professor Prentice and Mr. Gallagher. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I know that we will be able to take your lessons and apply them to our own lives. As a token of our appreciation, the Undergraduate Business Council would like to present Mr. Gallagher with his personalized Stetson cowboy hat in recognition of his participation in the VIP Distinguished Speaker Series.
Excellent.